Today you'll learn the most common ways to sound fluent, advanced, and professional when you're answering questions. You can use these during your IELTS speaking test, job interviews, or even when you're chatting with your friends. You'll learn phrases to talk about your preferences, opinions, past experience, hypothetical situations, balanced answers, examples, and when you're unsure. Welcome back to JForrest English. Of course, I'm Jennifer. Now let's get started. First, let's talk about preferences. This is when you must choose between two or more options. For example, do you prefer to study in the morning or at night? You have to express your preference. To start your answer, you can say, I'd say. This is I would say. I'd say I generally prefer. So that's your start to the answer, and then you state your preference. I'd say I generally prefer studying in the morning. You can add on over at night, so you're using both of the options and stating your preference. An alternative, I tend to study in the morning more than at night. So here you're saying what your routine is, because when you tend to do something, it means you do it most of the time. Or you can use most of the time as an alternative. Most of the time I study at night. Or you can say I'm most alert in the morning, so that's when I study. Notice here you're providing the reason first and then you're stating what your preference is. Or you can also contrast your current state to a past and use I used to. I used to, and then your base verb. I used to prefer evenings, but my work schedule has changed, so now I study in the mornings. Now, of course, this is just the beginning to your answer. You have to go on and then give more information about your preference. Now let's talk about opinions. So of course, when you're sharing what you think, if you agree or disagree, or your general view. So the question might be, do you think children should learn to cook at school? So you have to share your opinion. Of course, you can say, in my opinion, in my opinion. This is the start. And I recommend in spoken English, you take a small pause because that reflects the comma. In my opinion, children shouldn't learn to cook at school. And of course, you need to go on and explain your opinion. But now you know how to instantly start your answer. You can say, it depends on the situation, but I'd say children should learn to cook at school. Notice what I did here. I stated my preference, but I started with, it depends on the situation. So I'm letting the person know that I'm open to considering other views, or I'm open to considering a specific situation where the opposite is true. And you've already learned, but I'd say, I would say, in spoken English, I'd say, but I'd say children should learn to cook at school. You can say, to be honest. This is a great way to start, and especially since it gives you a second to think about what you're going to say next. To be honest, again, a short pause. To be honest, I'm completely opposed to teaching children how to cook at school. So you can use to be honest when you're about to share something very directly, or perhaps it's not the opinion that most people have. Instead of to be honest, you can use honestly. They're the same. You can use them interchangeably. Honestly, I completely support teaching children how to cook at school. A great starter that natives use in both professional and casual situations is, as far as I'm concerned. This is longer, so make sure you get all those words. As far as I'm, the verb to be conjugated. As far as I'm concerned, with that soft D at the end. As far as I'm concerned, this is an alternative to in my opinion or I think. As far as I'm concerned, children should focus on the most important academic subjects at school. Let's move on to past experiences. So this is when you're describing a time or talking about memories. So someone may ask you, describe a time when you traveled somewhere new. That's definitely an IELTS style question. In a job interview, it could absolutely be describe a time when you handled a difficult situation. So think about how you can adapt these in your day-to-day life so you can use them more than just on a language exam or just in a job interview. Now, the key here is that the situation is in the past. So you can say, I remember. Remember is in the present simple. I remember back in 2019. So you can say, I remember in 2019, but if you say back in 2019, using back in emphasizes that you think this was a long time ago. I remember back in 2019 when I took my first trip abroad. Of course, remember, this is how you start your sentence, how you start your answer. You still then need to provide the details of your answer. Or you can say, one time that really stands out. This is definitely the way a native would answer. One time, so one time represents the time you traveled abroad or the time you handled a difficult situation. One time that really stands out. If it stands out, it means that it's what you remember, it's what seems the most important or the most obvious. One time that really stands out is when, and then you provide your answer. When I visited the United States for the first time. You can say the first trip that comes to mind. That comes to mind. The first trip that comes to mind is, and then you have to state that trip. My weekend camping trip with my family last month. You can say the last time I traveled somewhere new. So you're using the language from the question in your answer. The last time I handled a difficult situation was, and then a time reference, was 3 years ago. And then you go on and you state the activity. I attended my friend's wedding in Greece. Again, that's not the complete answer. You would go on and answer the full question. Here's a great one. I can clearly recall. Recall is another way of saying remember, and clearly that's your adverb. Adverbs are optional in a sentence, so when you use them, they're very impactful. It means you have a very clear image. I can clearly recall the moment when. Now, if you use this, you're setting the tone that something really memorable or amazing happened. So make sure you provide something memorable or amazing, but of course that's subjective. I can clearly recall the moment when I saw the Eiffel Tower for the first time. And then you can go on and describe that experience. Now let's talk about hypotheticals. This is when you talk about imaginary situations, often including the words if, could. For example, if you could live in any city, where would you choose? So to answer this, use that same structure. If I could live in any city, I would live in San Francisco. So you're using the same structure from the question. This is the clearest way to answer. And then of course, go on and provide your reason why. There are alternative things you can say. If I had the chance, I would definitely live in Vancouver. So if I had the chance, if this situation were available. Now you can just use I would. I would likely choose Tokyo. You can use choose instead of live in. Or likely means 50, 60%. You can make that stronger. I would definitely choose Tokyo. That means 80, 90, 95%. You can start your answer with your choice. Name the city. Seattle is a vibrant city, so I would live there if I had the chance. Notice you're just reversing the structure. So I would live there if I had the chance, if I could. You can provide the reason. Due to its proximity to my family, I would live in Seoul. This is an advanced structure because you're saying due to its proximity, but at this point you haven't defined what it is. So it creates curiosity because the person has to wait until you reveal the answer. I would live in Seoul. Let's move on to balanced answers. These are used when you want to discuss both sides instead of choosing one. For example, do you think young people prefer cities or rural areas? And you don't want to choose one. You want to provide a balanced answer. You can start by saying, well, it really depends on the person. You don't have to use well. This is more of an introduction. It doesn't provide meaning, but natives commonly use it. Well, and it shows you're reflecting on the question and you're gathering your thoughts, you're forming an opinion. It's a natural thing to do. Well, it really depends on the person. It depends on the situation. It depends on, you can provide a different noun here and then go on and discuss both sides. Or you can start with some people prefer lively cities, while others prefer quiet rural areas. So you're providing adjectives to go with both to give you something to discuss more. You can say there are good arguments on both sides. This lets the person know that you could argue positively for one and the other. And then you can go on and share those arguments. There are good arguments. Good is an adjective. You can choose a different one. There are great arguments on both sides. Alternatively, you can say there are pros and cons to both. So that means there are positives and negatives. And you can add on to the last one as well. It depends on the person. It depends on the person. And then you can discuss the person who would prefer cities and the person who would prefer rural areas. You can state, that's difficult to answer. That's difficult to answer because it comes down to personal preference. It comes down to means you must consider. There's this important reason or explanation. It comes down to personal preference. Now let's review example requests. This is when you're asked to provide an example, a very common thing on your IELTS and in job interviews and in daily conversations. Can you give an example of when you worked collaboratively? So this could be for your IELTS, of course, for a job interview as well. And now, if the question starts with can you, acknowledge that part and say certainly, certainly. That's acknowledging the can you. It's like saying yes, I can. Certainly, for example. Certainly, for example, and then you state the situation. Last month, I was part of a project, and then you go on and describe your role and how it was collaborative. Instead of certainly, you can say absolutely. The first example that comes to mind. This means the first example I thought of, but a more advanced way is the first example that comes to mind is, and then what came to your mind? What did you think of when I joined a soccer team? Because sports is very collaborative. Or again, to acknowledge the request, can you? You can reply with I'd love to, I would, I'd love to. A great example of working collaboratively is when I was asked to organize a conference. So you're saying a great example. Or again, to say yes, definitely. The best example of working collaboratively is a project I'm on now. So your answer doesn't necessarily have to be in the past. Now, the most casual way is just to simply say, sure. One example I can share is. That's the most casual. Natives will absolutely use that. Sure. One example I can share is when I volunteered at my daughter's school. Of course, there are going to be times when you're unsure, when you don't know much about the topic, but you still need to answer. So if someone asks you, when do you think space travel will become accessible to the average person? Now they're asking you when. They expect a specific time. Be honest. Say, honestly, I don't know. But don't stop there. That's not enough to impress anyone. In a more formal situation, even when you're talking with your friends, that is a conversation killer. You need to provide more information, but you can absolutely acknowledge, honestly, I don't know. Adding honestly sounds more confident than simply saying, I don't know. Honestly, I don't know, but I imagine it will happen this century. So instead of providing a specific answer, you can provide a more vague or general answer. This century, that's a very long timeline, right? But you answered the question. And what happens next is important. Provide your reason why you think it will happen this century. Then you've answered this very professionally. You can say, I'm not entirely sure. Adding entirely softens it. I'm not entirely sure, but I suppose. Suppose is another way of saying think, but I suppose it could happen in the next 20 years. So again, you're providing a more general time reference rather than a specific answer. You can say, I can't say for certain, but I think my grandkids will experience this. So depending what your age is, the person you're talking to will estimate the age of your grandkids, present or future, and then understand the time reference. So that's a great strategy. Or you can say, well, I haven't thought about that before. It may happen by, and then provide a time. But well, I haven't thought about that before. This is a great way to start your answer immediately and give you time to think. And then you don't have to be precise. You can be more general. It may happen by 2035 or whatever year you feel confident providing, and then provide the reason why. Remember, we talked about saying that's a difficult question. This is the perfect time to say it. That's a difficult question. If I had to guess, I would say, so you can use I'd say or I would say in the next 100 years. So here again, you're being quite vague. You're saying any time between now and 100 years from now, in the next 100 years. If I had to guess, that makes it sound like you don't have the option. It's a requirement. If I had to guess, because you're asking me and you expect to answer, I would say in the next 100 years. Now you have the most common conversation starters for answering questions professionally and confidently. Do you want to keep learning more about answering questions? If you do, put let's go, put let's go in the comments. And of course, make sure you like this lesson, share it with your friends, and subscribe so you're notified every time I post a new lesson. And you can get this free speaking guide where I share 6 tips on how to speak English fluently and confidently. You can click here to download it or look for the link in the description. And here's another lesson I know you'll love. Watch it now.